This is my capstone 4 project. I will be recording and showing, my process from start to finish in regards to my thesis and my data and describing my data. First, I just wanted to show the two research questions that I came up with. The first one being, how does wealth and one's social status directly affect their health and quality of healthcare? As we learned in our book, people with more money are able to demand more and receive more because they have that wealth to back them up, and they can pick and choose how to invest their wealth. So that was something that interests me that I could research. And then also, can one's cultural identity or ethnic group hinder their ability to receive quality healthcare? So we also learned a little bit about how different ethnicities receive different kinds of healthcare and different quality as well. My thesis changed quite a bit to just kind of refine, and I wanted to show that. So this is the first one I just read. Next, it was whether one's cultural identity or ethnic group hinders their ability to acknowledge and receive help for mental illness. So I honed into mental illness to try to be able to get better data, but I was also given the feedback that, you can't get specific research if you are just generalizing cultural identity and ethnic group, which is why I switched it to how African American and Asian Americans' ethnic background affect their willingness to acknowledge and receive help for mental illness. So more so focusing on how culture plays a role in acknowledging and receiving help for mental illness, and then also narrowing down the area. City Heights is where I work in, and it's one of the most diverse populations in San Diego as well as California. So I wanted to pick that location to narrow down the population and then further narrow down the sample size. I also wanted to show my articles from the literature review that helped give me insight and information. The first one here was a study of 252 university students. This was used to measure cultural orientation and attitudes towards mental illness. And the findings showed minorities from the study had a higher authoritarian attitude, and simultaneously congruent levels of vertical individualism had a higher stigmatizing attitude towards mental illness. So with vertical individualism, believing that everyone was more or less equal to each other and that you had to work hard to get what you wanted, stigmatized mental illness more. So in knowing that, I wanted to see what culture or ethnic group supports stigmas in mental illness. And this second article showed, in regards to South Asians and white American young adults from a Facebook study, it actually showed that there is a significant difference between Asians who sought out health and received help to seek treatment for a mental illness versus white individuals, and also a substantial difference in whether character deficits were the cause of mental illness with Asian groups. And it was noted here as well that family bonding may play a factor because that culture may be fearful of bringing shame or dishonor to the family. So in seeing that, if culture does affect your perceived cause, I want to know if it also affects the perceived need for mental illness services. This sample was large. It was a 6-year time period to survey white, African American, Hispanic, and Asian Americans, and it showed that there was the perceived need was reportedly lower in all races as opposed to whites, specifically African Americans and Asians, which is the group that I was focusing on. So it showed that somehow these cultures played a part in believing that mental health services were not as needed as they really are. And we saw above that South Asian Americans perceive shame or dishonor in regards to mental illness. So why is there the disparity between African Americans, which showed in this study of Hispanics, African Americans, and whites in relation to the utilization of services, and also ideas are revolving around mental health disorders, and it showed that ethnic minority participants consistently endorsed spirituality and normalization, whereas white participants didn't. So African Americans normalizing the mental health or mental illnesses that some people may have versus actually believing that help is needed, which would tie into the survey regarding why there's such a low amount that utilize the services. But I also felt like there was a further explanation missing, and this fifth article kind of gave that in regards to why there's a lower number of African Americans participating, and they claim that racial and ethnic minority individuals experience microaggressions daily and may also experience them in treatment. So that could be another possible reason as to why, but I think that their culture affects it. I also want to make sure I'm showing the references as I go along and as I talk about these things to make sure that all of my work is cited. Now I want to explain how I got my data. The methodology I used was surveys. I wanted to send out a survey. Originally, I wanted to get qualitative data. However, it ended up being quantitative just because it was easier. I was more likely to get responses back with a rating scale or with a yes or no answer versus having open-ended questions or doing interviews. And based on the time that was given to us in order to collect these samples, survey was just the best way to go. I decided to send this survey to the members of Thrive Public School, where I am currently employed. Research has shown that those who come from different backgrounds, who have different education levels, who make a different amount of money, tend to experience the world in a different way. So I wanted to choose everyone who is quite similar, and this data shows it. So this survey link was sent out via email. I got 45 responses. It was sent to 81 people, so a total return rate of 55.56%. I wanted to quickly show the ages of those who were interviewed. It shows the percentages here in a pie chart, and the ages are over here. The ethnicity is important. I want to note that the 2 or more races in Honduran American was qualified as a Caucasian or white because that was one of the races that they were mixed in or that they identified with. They were put in the Caucasian or white population. So 27 here, 7 African American or Black, 5 Hispanic or Latino, 1 Native American or Native Alaskan, and 5 Asian Pacific Islanders answered this. And here is the education level. Again, we almost have an equal amount here of bachelor's and master's degrees, with some over here that have doctorates, some high school, and then high school graduate. So I just want to show one sample of the questions that I asked and then go to my main focus to try to prove or disprove my thesis. So this is an example. Mental illness is a serious issue. This was the rating scale. They had, again, 1 to 5. They could choose whether they strongly disagreed all the way up to strongly agreed. And this shows majority chose strongly agree. Once I received this data, I pulled it and put it into an Excel spreadsheet because, again, it was important to understand whether or not, again, African Americans and Asians, their ethnic group played a role in acknowledging and receiving mental health services. So the way that I sorted this, once I pulled it from that survey that you saw before, I sectioned them based by ethnicity, then by their age, then by their degrees. So I wanted to show the data results that I got from this and what stood out and whether or not my thesis was correct. So here, the African Americans, the group size was 7. I picked 3 main questions that could shed insight as to whether or not ethnicity played a role in acknowledging and receiving help. The first was, it would embarrass my family if I told others I had a mental illness. 3 out of 7 agreed, 1 was neutral. The second question, my culture doesn't believe mental illness is a real disease. 3 out of 7 African Americans agreed with that. Again, 1 was neutral, and the rest disagreed. My culture regularly talks about mental health. 4 disagreed. How does your cultural group view mental health? This was an open-ended question as well as the following question. However, 2 stated that they view it as, that their culture views it as a personal problem, and 3 stated that it's not talked about. So 5 out of 7 people, although answers were a little bit different, showed that there's either not a conversation happening about it or that it's a personal problem. And then the second question, how does your cultural group view people with mental illness? 6 out of 7 said that they are viewed as weak or that they should be able to control it. So that is almost 100% of the African American population I had that said that. Next, I wanted to show the Asian Americans. The first question, 2 agreed that it would embarrass their families, 2 were neutral. 1 agreed that their culture doesn't believe mental illness is a real disease, while 2 were neutral and the rest disagreed. My culture regularly talks about mental health. 3 strongly disagreed, and 1 was neutral. And then how does your culture group view mental health? 4 out of 5 said that it's not talked about, and the other one stated you only talk about it to a professional. And then in the end, how does your cultural group view people with mental illness? 3 said it's avoided and not talked about, and 2 said as a character deficiency or weakness, which correlated with my literary review and my academic journals and their research. I wanted to show the group of 25, the white and Caucasian group. The first one, 8 strongly disagreed with their family being embarrassed as to whether or not they had a mental illness, and 9 disagreed. Whether mental illness is a real disease or not, 8 strongly disagreed and 12 disagreed. So they do believe that their culture recognizes it. The third one regularly talks about mental health. 1 strongly agreed and 9 agreed. And how does your cultural group view mental health? 15 out of 25 stated that it is a recognized problem from their cultural group. And then how do people view people with mental illness? 19 stated that they can recognize and acknowledge that they need help and that they are accepted. So now that we've seen the data, I wanted to go to towards the discussion portion of this in regards to understanding these results and whether or not it proved my thesis. Here again is the question, I believe it would embarrass my family if I told others I had a mental health condition. This was specifically based upon their upbringing in this cultural group. 40% of the Asian Pacific Islander population agreed with that, while 42% of the African American population agreed with that, and only 20% of the Caucasian population agreed with that. So we can see here in this pie chart, based upon this question, that it looks like the ethnic minorities would embarrass their families by admitting to having this condition, which in turn would affect or hinder their ability to accept having a mental illness, and definitely play a role in whether or not they would receive treatment. The second one was the question, was the statement, my cultural group doesn't believe mental illness is a real disease. 20% of the Asian Pacific Islander population agreed with that, while again 42% of the African American population agreed, and only 12% of the Caucasian and white population agreed with that. So again, we saw in my literary review that there was a difference between the Asian population and their data results in regards to help and receiving services. In regards to mental illness, while there was a larger gap in between African Americans, and this pie chart here and this answer is also correlating and showing that as well, that there's a larger disparity between African Americans and other culture groups as to whether or not mental illness is a disease. And if you don't view it as a disease, then you obviously wouldn't be seeking treatment for it. And the last question, my cultural group regularly talks about mental health, and this is showing who disagreed with it. 60% of the Asian population disagreed with that statement. They do not believe that they regularly talk about mental health, whereas 57% of the African American population disagreed with that, while only 24% of the Caucasian population disagreed with that. So again, it's just showing here, and I believe that it proved my thesis, that based upon one's cultural or ethnic group, and specifically the two that I was looking at, African American and Asian Pacific Islanders, their cultures play a role as to whether or not they can accept and acknowledge that someone has a mental health issue or whether they have an illness, and it also can play a role in seeking help. Something to know about this, obviously we were given a short amount of time to be able to do this, so I didn't get as many from the African American or Asian population as I would have liked to be able to give more of a concrete answer and look at this on a larger scale. But I believe based upon this data, it confirms everything that was in my literary review and also confirms my thesis that these groups have some sort of stigma, and that their ethnicity and their cultural identity does play a role in regards to whether or not they can accept and receive services for mental health. So this was my data that was pulled from the survey, and this was my Capstone 4 project.